Good morning. We are in Nehemiah chapter 5 today. So I want to start this morning by looking at Deuteronomy 24. So turn to Deuteronomy. Turn to Nehemiah. Deuteronomy 24. We're going to start in verse 19. Okay. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. So now go to Nehemiah 5. So Moses, we know in the law of Moses that God had told them, commanded the Israelites that whenever you were harvesting, to leave your extra sheaves, your extra grapes, your extra olives, leave that behind. What story in the Bible did someone leave stuff behind? Yes, left it behind for Ruth. So this is a commandment. And it was meant so that people that were aliens, fatherless, and widows could go behind them and pick up what was left. Anyone who didn't have what the Israelites had them and didn't have the means of getting what they needed could go and do this. But at the end of the command, God gave his people the reason why. What was the reason for this? What did he say? Yeah, remember that you were once slaves in Egypt. That is why I'm commanding you to do this. So the Israelites were no strangers to poverty or oppression, and they had themselves been powerless and enslaved in Egypt at one time. And it was only because of the goodness of God that they were being blessed with lots of crops and lots of grapes and lots of olives, everything that they needed. So, over and over and over again in Israelite history, you hear the word remember. Remember, remember, remember. And what do we do every Sunday morning? We're remembering. Okay, there's something about that. Remember that. So up to this point, Nehemiah has faced several kinds of challenges, but they primarily focused on outside of Judah. All the threats and everything were not coming from his own brethren. They were coming from outside. And yet we get to this chapter and he's going to face one of the most difficult things that he has to face. And it's not coming from outside of Judah. It's now coming from within. Okay? So let's start reading in verses 1 through 5 of chapter 5. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their Jewish brothers. Some were saying, "We and our sons and our daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." And still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and our vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." Oh, wow. Okay, these problems have nothing to do with Sanballat and his gang. And as if Nehemiah didn't have plenty of things to worry about, now he's going to have to listen to people grumbling and complaining about other Jews to him. So apparently you find out right off the bat that there's been some sort of famine. Okay, so there are some unusual circumstances here. It had contributed to a food shortage. And what happens when people can't get food and they're hungry? They start complaining just like they have been for years and years and years. When they didn't have enough to eat, they complained about it. And I know this has nothing at all to do with the pandemic and going to the grocery store, but the oddest things are not at the grocery store. You go, and we just expect to go to HEB and see our shortening on right there, or our cat food there, or our baby formula there. And when it's not there, who do we blame? Yeah. We go to the top person, whoever the leader is, it's his fault. Somehow, they go to that. Well, guess who's in charge here? Nehemiah. Poor Nehemiah. No exception, We've got to find who's in charge of this outfit and blame him or go to him with our complaints. And that is what they do. They cry out to Nehemiah for help. Now, the people have got 4 distinct problems. The first is they don't have enough food. That's just one. They say they have got to have grain in order to stay alive. That sounds dire. It sounds like to the point where, okay, we're going to starve to death if we can't get the food that we need. And so that was one problem. But it would seem that while everybody has been off working on the wall, who has been planting and harvesting? Nope, they haven't been doing that. They have occupied, their time has been spent on the wall, okay? And that is the second problems. That's the second problem. While they were working on the wall, they haven't been planting their fields, and instead they have mortgaged their fields, their vineyards, and their homes in order to have food on the table. So they've mortgaged them. Another issue is that some of them didn't want to mortgage their property and chose rather to borrow money from their own Jewish brothers. And they had to do that in order to pay property taxes to the king. So if they didn't want to sell it, and they ended up mortgaging it off to their brothers for money so that they could pay their taxes and eat. All right, well, that leads to problem number 4. To repay these creditors, their own brothers, they had to sell their children into slavery. So if you want to read about Hebrew slaves, Exodus 21, 2 through 11 and Deuteronomy 15, 12 through 8 talk all about the regulations with owning slavery. What happened on the year of Jubilee, which was year 7? They let them go free. They let them go free, all of them. They let them go free. But there are very distinct guidelines with how you dealt with slavery. But if you can imagine, if you've had to sell your children as a slave in order to make ends meet, they're in a hopeless state. And they're powerless right now. And basically what Nehemiah has on his hands is an huge economic, internal conflict. Okay? And it's got to be dealt with. I'm going to read now verses 6 through 8. When I heard their outcry and these charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials, and I told them, you are exacting usury from your own countrymen. So I called together a large meeting to deal with them, and I said, as far as possible, we have bought back our Jewish brothers who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your brothers only for them to be sold back to us? They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. All right, there's more going on to this than meets the eye. What were you going to say, Mary?
I said, you are the man.
Yeah, you are the man. The word usury is used in verse 7. So usury is an illegal action in which men lend money at an unreasonably high rate of interest. These Jews that lent money to the poor Jews were charging them interest on their loans. Guess what? The Jews were forbidden to do that. I want you to look at Leviticus 25. Let's read Leviticus 25. You'd wondered why Nehemiah is so angry. Well, here it is. Leviticus 25, verse 35. I'll give you a minute to find that. Starting in verse 35. If one of your countrymen becomes poor and he's unable to support himself among you, help him as you would an alien or a temporary resident, so he can continue to live among you. Do not take interest of any kind from him, but fear your God, so that your countrymen may continue to live among you. You must not lend him money at interest or sell food to him at a profit. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If one of your countrymen becomes poor among you and sells himself to you, do not make him work as a slave. He is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you, and he is to work for you until the year of Jubilee.
Debbie?
Yeah.
In American Standard, verse 36 says, do not take usurious interest.
Okay.
It's very specific.
Okay.
It doesn't just say interest.
Okay. Does anybody's... So that's 36?
Mm-hmm.
Do not take interest of any kind.
Okay, so now I'm trying to figure out where they supposed to... What does yours say?
It says Hezbo, do not, no usury or interest.
Or interest, okay. Okay, so I might have to dig a little further into that, okay? I'm going to keep reading. I'm in verse 41. Then he and his children are to be released, and he will go back to his own clan and to the property of his forefathers. Because the Israelites are my servants, whom I brought out of Egypt, they must not be sold as slaves. Do not rule over them ruthlessly, but fear your God. Okay, so I took this to mean, as I looked at several commentators as well, that they were not supposed to take interest, period, the end. That's what I took that to mean. And when that word was used, not only were they taking interest, but they were charging them at a high rate of interest.
Yeah.
And that was why Nehemiah was angry.
Yeah.
He was angry over it, okay?
Well,
So,
in my notes it says interest and usury, but they're being real specific about the usury part, and that gets back to Nehemiah.
yeah. Also, look at verse 5. Verse 5 says something, although we are of the same flesh and blood as our countrymen, and though our sons are as good as theirs. That's verse 5 in Nehemiah. I think that that makes it sound like we're being taken advantage of.
Right.
You're saying that your family members or you people are better than we are, and you're taking advantage of us in that way. So, again, I think that means that interest is probably high.
Yeah. The thing that's so terrible is that it's among the Jews that these are not taxes to the Persian government.
That's right.
Which were also charged.
That's right. Okay. So you've all heard of price gouging. Mm-hmm. When all of Houston is trying to leave because there's a hurricane coming, and you come to the only gas station in 15 miles and they're charging double or triple, and that's why the state of Texas says you cannot do that, you will be reported and we're going to come back and get you, kind of thing. That's price gouging. So, but the bad and the really sad thing is that in order to put food on the table, these poor people, specifically their daughters, had been sold off to these rich Jews as slaves. Poor Nehemiah. He has had a trowel in one hand trying to work on the wall. He's had a sword in the other hand trying to defend what he's trying to do. And now he has to be a mediator between his own countrymen over something like this. Selling your own brothers and sisters into slavery so that you can put food on the table. I mean, it's hard, okay? And Nehemiah has every right to be angry. Mistreating those who can't defend themselves is what Nehemiah is angry about. In our society, oppression and abuse is usually inflicted upon the powerless.
Yeah, that's why they kept quiet. They knew they were guilty.
They're guilty. Yeah, they're guilty. So where's their compassion for one another? There was no mercy and there was no compassion. Notice that he doesn't act quickly. He ponders it. He's going to give himself some time to cool down, first of all, and think about what he's going to say. I think there's a lesson there for us. If Nehemiah, this righteous person that I put up on this pedestal, has to have time away to calm down and come up with the right words, I need to be doing that also, okay? So he doesn't act very quickly. He cools down, and then he goes public and he confronts the people. Notice who he is confronting. The nobles and the officials. Now, where does Nehemiah fit in all that? Well, yes. He's a noble and an official too, okay? But it's these people that are doing this, all right? He gives an example. He's going to try to shame them by saying what he's going to say or make them feel guilty. And he told them that he and some other people had done all that they could to buy back those that were enslaved by Gentile believers. We have bought them back, and now they're part of us. And now you have sold them back into that same predicament, and they're our brothers. It made him mad. I can tell he's mad over it. He says, we saw a need, we came together, we paid for our brothers to be free men, and now you have sold your own brothers as slaves to one another. The contrast that he gives is humiliating, and they don't have anything to say. You know, they're speechless. Okay, so let's see where this is going, verse 9. So I continued, what you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain, but let the exacting of usury stop. Give back to them immediately their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses, and also the usury you are charging them, the 100th part of the money, grain, new wine, and oil. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. So Nehemiah just tells them, you're wrong. What you're doing is wrong. And the biggest argument so far is that he says people are watching you. All these Gentile people outside are watching you, watching what you're doing. Your actions reflect badly on you, but then they reflect badly upon Jehovah God. You think about it. The way we treat one another, our community is watching us. But who does that honor or who does that dishonor when we do that? Yes, yes. And that's exactly what he says. Where is your respect toward God? And he specifically says the part about, shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God? If you go back to what we read in Deuteronomy, it talked about fear God. It said it more than once. Fear God. Yeah, Mary?
This proverb is, he who oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God.
Okay, that's a proverb?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Proverbs 14:31.
Proverbs 14:31. Okay. Okay, so he basically looks at these guys and says, this is the opportunity that Gentiles have been looking for all along. You know, an opportunity to mock our God, to make us look small and to make him look small. Nehemiah then admits that he has made personal loans to people. He didn't charge any interest at all. If they were in need, I gave them what they needed, he says. He says, there have been many that have been doing that same thing. I and my brothers, in verse 10, and my men have been lending the people money and grain. If it's money they needed, we gave them money. If it was food they needed, we gave them food. So he's been doing that too. And he says, he calls upon them, he says, I expect you right now to give back everything. Everything. You give them back their vineyard, you give them back their land, you give them back whatever they need, and you've got to give back the usury. You've got to give that back as well. So, Lonnie says the word the 100th. That's in verse 11, the end of verse 11. The 100th part of the money. The 100th part of the money means 1%. So to us, 1%, that's not very much. That's not very much at all in our Western ears. But if it's 1% per month, that's 12%. That is a lot. That is a lot. We don't know exactly what it was, but whatever it was that was being charged, Nehemiah says, give it back. It was wrong. You deserve this reprimand. It's time for you to give it back. All right. Let's look at verse 12. Let's see what their response is. We will give it back. We will give it back, they said. And we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say. Then I summoned the priest and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe, and I said, in this way may God shake out of his house and possessions every man who does not keep this promise. So may such a man be shaken out and emptied. At this, the whole assembly said, Amen. And they praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised. So we're going to stop there. All right. They admit we're wrong. But Nehemiah is not ready to accept just words of apology. He's going to require a few things. He wanted justice, and he wanted witnesses. Who does he call in? The priest. He calls in the big guys. Okay, now this is a spiritual issue. Okay, if you're going to tell me that you're going to make it right, I want you to promise that you're going to make it up. Back it up with an oath. Those are his terms, and they readily agree. And then he's going to perform this symbolic act. So I got online and I Googled, did Bible Times robes have pockets? Because I was like, apparently what he does is when you have a robe that you have on and you tie it with a belt, when you tie it, you make folds, kind of like pleats when you're sewing around and inside of these folds, they would keep personal items, things. So I got to thinking, okay, so they probably had a money pouch, which they might thread through the robe somehow. And if they didn't want somebody to know, they could hide that in the fold of their... But then I thought, what else do they hide in their robes? And how could you keep it tucked into your belt and not be dropping things on the ground all over the place? I'm like, what is that? It's interesting. I was like, what other things would they have carried in Bible times? Their chapstick, or I guess, I don't know. But it was interesting study. Well, Nehemiah, he says he took the loose part of his robe around his waist, and then he took it and he just shook it, as if everything that was in that would come out and be seen. And basically, he says Nehemiah invoked God to literally empty them out of his house if they did not abide by this oath. All right. What did Paul do to a city if they refused to listen to what he had to say? What did he do when he left? Off his feet. It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. This is just a different way of saying that. Just another example of that. So let's read 14 through 19. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to their food and their wine. Their assistants also lorded over the people. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on this wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day, 1 ox, 6 choice sheep, and some poultry were prepared for me, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allotted to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, O my God, for all I have done for these people. Well, we find out a whole bunch more about Nehemiah here, okay? He was considered a governor, and apparently he was considered a governor for 12 years. Now, we know of our study early on in Ezra, who was the man that returned with the first group of people? Starts with Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel, we thought he was considered a governor. Well, it's been many, many years. So when he's talking about somebody that was hard on the people, I do not believe he's talking about Zerubbabel, but there have been others since then. Okay, so some of them have not treated them very kindly. What kind of privileges do you have if you're the governor? From reading this, they get better food, they get wine, and they get a salary of some sort. You know, there's nothing wrong.
They get to take land.
And they get to, and they apparently they get to take land. Okay, so all of these things. Nehemiah gave up these privileges simply because he loved the Jewish people and he loved God. He gave them up. So, Nehemiah is not the only one giving up certain comforts. He is joined by other people. So for 12 years, he does not take the salary for his position. He not only gave up his salary, but he gave up his allotment of choice food, fine wine, and the dignity of the position. So, one reason, okay, so Donna and I are getting ready to take our sister trip. We take sister trips together. That's my sister. And last year was our first trip together where we took a cruise. Do you know what the number one thing was on the cruise that we liked?
Food.
You guys are so smart. You guys are smart. Okay. When Donna and I we went a couple of years ago, we went up to Niagara Falls. Well, we had breakfast bars in the car. We would have protein shakes. I brought my protein powder. We would have protein shakes. We were lucky if we ate at the local Taco Bell. One reason we liked the cruise is because the food is fantastic. We're like, man, it's everywhere. You can have all you want to eat, that kind of thing. I don't want, if somebody told me I had to go on a cruise and I wasn't going to get my food, I would be like, well, then why are we going? You know, why are we going to do this? For Nehemiah to give that up, you know, that says something to me. I'm not very good at giving up what I want to eat, you know, and he gave that up too. That says something about him. There are really two reasons why he waived his salary and the perks that came with the job. Look at verse 15. What does it say in verse 15?
Because of the fear of God.
But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. So he loves God. That's reason number one. What's reason number two? I really think verse 19 probably says it better. It says, remember me with favor, O my God, for all I have done for these people. He loved the people. He loved the Jewish people.
He didn't lord it over.
Yeah. These other people, his predecessors, had taken advantage of their positions, even mistreating the people. And he wasn't going to do that. Nehemiah could not see himself accepting all of this while others struggled to survive. He saw himself as God's servant. He would honor God more by putting the welfare of the people ahead of his own personal gains. He really had a heart of service. So, how does Nehemiah provide financially for himself for 12 years when he's feeding 150 Jews at his table? How? How does he do that? Well, apparently being a cupbearer paid really well because he is financially independent. He looked at the wealth that he had and thought, I don't need this. If it's going to take away from the people, I'm willing to let that go. So he had astounding integrity to look at his salary and say, if it will help my people, I don't need any more than what I already have. So I Googled, has there ever been a leader of the United States that gave up their salary?
Yes.
Yes.
Washington and Trump.
Not Washington. Not Washington. Herbert Hoover was the first one, President Herbert Hoover. President John F. Kennedy gave up his salary, and President Trump. Now, John F. Kennedy, I read, had something, he's inherently wealthy. He had something like $10 million a year given to him, even when he was president. That's a lot of money. He looked at it and thought, I don't need the salary. President Trump looked at his salary and thought, I don't need the salary. They made him pay $1. They made Trump pay $1 because of tax purposes. So he paid $1. What Trump did is, rather than just not taking it at all, he took it and he gave it away. He gave it, I have a list. He gave it to the national parks, education, human services, transportation. When it got to 2019, when the pandemic hit, it went to the Surgeon General's office, the Assistant Secretary of Health, the Department of Health and Human Services. It just totally switched to where he was giving his salary to. But I found it interesting that they gave their salaries. That is similar to Nehemiah. That's where the similarities end. Okay? Nehemiah did this out of love for God and love for his country. He did it. I don't know why these other guys, except that they just had all the wealth that they needed. Yeah.
We saw Nehemiah's heart in the very first verse.
Yes.
Because he was heartbroken over the ruins of and he
Of what it looked like.
He was a true Jew.
Yes, he was. So Nehemiah's example is just the perfect example of gospel living. As opposed to, I'm going to take whatever's rightfully mine. He did not have that kind of a mindset at all. We have a New Testament example of someone who was not paid for their job. Do y'all know who it was? Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9:15 that he never took a salary for preaching the gospel. He never took anything for preaching. What did he do instead? What was he?
Made tents.
He made tents. He was a tent maker. Exactly. Okay, so we find out a little bit more about Nehemiah's sacrifice, the fact that he had to feed 150 Jews and occasionally dignitaries, and what it took to do that. It specifically says that it took 1 ox, 6 sheep, and some chickens, or poultry. And I thought, okay, so we're having a potluck here at the church building, and we kill an ox and 6 sheep and a couple of chicken. I'm like going, we could feed a lot of people on that. Maybe our ox are bigger. Maybe our gals are bigger, but I'm like, we could feed a lot of people,
They had to do all that heavy work. They probably were big.
Okay, yeah. So anyway, that was just another way that he showed benevolence and care and love for others. Lonnie says that would feed 200 people, and I got to thinking, I thought, no, it would feed more than that.
Yeah.
It would feed more than that, But
I just heard how big the ox was.
yeah, how big it was, yes, or how big the sheep were too. Besides all of this, Nehemiah is devoted to what? What does it say that he's devoted to in verse 16? On the work on the wall. God had put the work of the wall on his heart, and above all these things that were going on, he continued to work. He did it. He worked.
I have to say though, a bunch of men working hard labor like that could probably eat a whole.
They might could,
They
working
would
as
make
hard as they
sandwiches
were.
for lunch.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But
That's
it was
true.
only every 10 days, too.
So you think about poor Nehemiah. He has had to endure verbal assaults, physical threats, discouraged labors, abuses of power, economic distress, but he never diverted from his task.
But you know what you kind of read over and don't really think about? It says several times that his men did the same.
They
like
did.
him. He chose people around him that were like-minded.
Well, they were
that
like...
helped him keep his spirit up.
But what a leader and what an example.
Yeah.
If you see your leaders doing that,
Yeah.
That's what you do. The whole process of building may have slowed at times and altered at times because of enemies or wayward citizens, but his goal never changed. We are so easily persuaded, pulled away from our tasks sometimes, just easily distracted from things. And I think, what kind of things cause me to lose my focus? And I asked myself that question, what causes me? And a couple of things came to my head. I just wanted to see what y'all would say. What kind of things cause you to lose your focus? Come on, girls. Nothing.
Illness.
Family.
Illness?
Illness. Illness is
Financial.
financial problems, financial things going on. Yeah, I think so. Pride.
Sometimes greed.
Greed. Okay. Well, pride is one of those that you begin to feel so comfortable the minute you let your guard down, the devil. So pride's tricky. It's very tricky when it comes to that kind of thing. But yeah, greed also. You have to really sit back and ask yourselves, what are the things that cause me to get off track?
Yeah, and the strange thing about that is Satan knows all about that.
Oh, they do. He knows our
He
weaknesses.
knows my weakness.
That reminds me of DC's sermon where he says the devil takes advantages of changes in our circumstances.
Yeah. So look at Matthew 22. I'm going to end it with this one. I'm going to end class. I may be early today. I am early today. I'm really early today. Matthew 22. We're going to start in verse 37. This is Jesus talking. You know this. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Nehemiah exemplified that better than anybody did. He lived out the two greatest commandments, loving the Lord your God with your heart and your soul and your mind, and loving your neighbor as yourself. So he's a perfect example of that. That is the class for today. I will be back. If something happens to Albert on Monday, he's having surgery next Monday. If something happens and I need to stay in Lubbock, I'll contact somebody here. But I'll leave that. I won't know anything until Monday. My plan was to come home Tuesday so that I could teach next Wednesday. So we'll just play it by ear and go from there.